Well, hello. I wanted to talk to you today about a section that I found quite interesting in the ecclesiastical history of Eusebius, talking about the first church, as Eusebius states, in Egypt. That Mark, after he had written the gospel, that he was sent to Egypt and there founded churches in Alexandria. And that Philo came upon these people and he was so impressed with the way they conducted their lives that he decided to write about them. In chapter 17, Eusebius makes the very important point that Philo had become acquainted with Peter while he was preaching in Rome. And this is the teaching of the history books that Eusebius wrote, that Peter and Paul both jointly went to Rome and founded the Christian church there. Now, Philo met Peter in Rome, and he states that it is some years after that time that Philo decided to write this book, which was about the early Christians in Egypt. On the Contemplative Life is the name of the book, and Eusebius even goes on to say the book which was composed by him some years later, this is some years after meeting Peter, and it clearly contains those rules of the church that are even to this day observed among us. In the Contemplative Life, Philo is talking about the Therapeuts, and he calls them that because they apply remedies and they heal both body and soul, and that they served and worshiped God in purity and sincerity. And Philo goes on to say that they had initially just kind of flocked down there, and of course since then there are these little churches, little communities all over the place, but he is talking basically about the group that he saw in Egypt. And Eusebius points out that perhaps they were called Therapeutes at the time, really not sure what their official name was, but they definitely were Christians, and it's possible that the name Christian just wasn't being in use down there yet. And he points out that how they just gave all their property away, just as we are told in the book of Acts. And he says that everywhere in the world this race is found, it is fitting that both Greek and barbarian should share in this perfect good, but that it is particularly popular in Egypt, especially around Alexandria. And then they talk about how that in each house that they have, that there is a sanctuary or a monastery where they go and they perform the mysteries of their religious life. They don't bring in any food or drink, anything that is to the necessity, pertaining to the necessity of their bodies, but only the laws, the oracles of their prophets, hymns, and such things, and they spend the whole day reading the scriptures and explaining their philosophy and the philosophy of their fathers in an allegorical manner, unlike what we were told by the church today that everything is to be taken quite literally. We see that they allegorized everything. They saw that there was something spiritual written beneath the surface. And he goes on to say, they also have writings of ancient men who were the founders of their sect, who left many monuments of the allegorical method, and that they use these models and imitate their principles. And he goes on to say that these things seem to have been stated by a man who heard them expounding their sacred writings, and it is highly probable that these ancient works that they had were the Gospels and the writings of the apostles. And there is much said about how they conduct their lives, and he goes on to say that these statements of Philo we regard as referring clearly and indisputably to those of our communion. And then states, but if after these things anyone should obstinately persist in denying the reference, let him renounce his incredulity and be convinced by yet more striking examples which are to be found nowhere else, but in the evangelical religion of the Christians. So you've got to remember now is that Philo met Peter at Rome, and then he wrote these writings about these people, the ancient Therapeuts, and Eusebius tells us that more than likely the ancient writings that they had, the ancient people that founded their sect, were in all probability the Gospels, and that these people were Christians, even though they did not yet go by that name. And then he goes on and talks about how chaste the women are and how perfect everyone's conduct is, and that they just have to be Christians because, as you note again, nowhere else outside of the Christian church are people like this found. Because everybody knows that if you're not a Christian, you're just a total dirtbag, right? Well, it turns out that On the Contemplative Life was written by Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher, and he did much the same thing as the Christian church had done, as they took Judaism and Hellenized it, blended it with Greek philosophy and Greek pagan ideas. At any rate, this book was written by Philo in the year 10, a full 19 years before Jesus is even said to have been baptized. And yet we're told that this book was written after Peter had been preaching in Rome. It turns out these Therapeutes are more than likely Buddhist monks.